Title: The Lost Highway. The story begins. Jake Reynolds had been a truck driver for nearly 20 years, but nothing could have prepared him for the eerie silence that enveloped the dense forest he found himself driving through one cold autumn night. It was supposed to be a routine delivery. Drive through the mountains, cross the forest, and make it to the next town by morning. But things had gone off course. A detour sign had sent Jake down a narrow, unmarked road deep into the heart of the wilderness. He hadn't seen another car for hours, no signs of life, no radio signal, and worst of all, his GPS had stopped working. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like twisted arms, clawing at the edges of his truck. The only sound was the constant thrum of his engine and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. Jake wasn't scared easily, but the oppressive quiet of the forest was starting to get to him. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, winding deeper and deeper into the woods. His headlights barely penetrated the thick darkness ahead, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the trees. The first sign. Just as Jake began to consider turning back, he noticed something in the distance. A figure standing in the middle of the road. He squinted, trying to make out who or what it was. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't make any attempt to signal for help. It just stood there, eerily still. Jake slowed the truck and rolled down his window. "You okay, buddy?" he called out, his voice echoing through the night air. No response. As he inched closer, the figure became clearer in the truck's headlights. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. A ragged, gaunt figure with a face pale as death, wearing torn clothes caked with dirt. His eyes were dark pits, empty and unblinking. Jake felt a chill crawl down his spine. There was something deeply wrong with this person. The man's mouth slowly opened, and though Jake was still a good distance away, he heard the voice as though it were whispering right in his ear. "Turn back!" Jake slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. His instincts screamed at him to reverse, to get the hell out of there, but something else held him in place. Morbid curiosity, or perhaps the strange pull of the forest itself. Suddenly, the figure stepped to the side of the road, disappearing into the thick brush as if he had never been there at all. Jake's hands trembled on the steering wheel. He considered turning back, but the idea of navigating those narrow, winding roads in reverse through the dense forest seemed even more dangerous. The descent. Reluctantly, Jake pressed on, the trees growing thicker and the darkness closing in tighter. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on him. The air grew cold and the scent of damp earth filled his nostrils. The road was rough now, full of potholes and uneven ground, making his truck shudder with every bump. Then in the distance, he saw it. A faint light flickering through the trees. Relief washed over him. Maybe it was a house or a cabin where he could get directions or help. He sped up slightly, eager to escape the oppressive forest. As he rounded the next bend, he saw it clearly. An old, dilapidated gas station, its lights flickering weakly, casting an eerie glow over the decaying structure. Jake pulled into the lot, his truck rumbling to a stop. The place looked abandoned, but the lights were on. Someone had to be there. Jake stepped out of his truck, the crunch of gravel under his boots echoing through the stillness. The air was even colder now, and he pulled his jacket tighter around himself. He approached the gas station, his breath visible in the air. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the breeze. "Hello?" Jake called out, pushing the door open further. The interior was dark, dusty, and smelled of mildew. Old magazines were scattered across the floor, and the shelves were empty, save for a few rusted cans of food. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But then he heard it. A faint whisper, like the one from earlier, but this time it was all around him. "Turn back, leave, before it's too late." Jake froze. His skin crawled with dread. He backed up, his heart racing, and turned to leave the station. But as he stepped outside, the temperature dropped sharply. His breath came out in thick clouds, and the forest was deathly quiet. No wind, no rustling of leaves, just an oppressive, eerie silence. And then he saw them. Figures, dozens of them, emerging from the trees. Pale, hollow-eyed people, their clothes ragged, their skins stretched tight over their bones. They moved silently, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and despair. Jake's blood ran cold. He jumped back into his truck and slammed the door shut, locking it tight. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, jamming them into the ignition. The truck roared to life, and Jake floored the gas pedal, tearing out of the lot and back onto the narrow road. The final terror. As he sped through the forest, the figures followed. They didn't run, didn't chase after him in the usual sense. They simply appeared, standing at the edge of the road, watching him. No matter how fast he drove, no matter how far he went, they were always there, their empty eyes tracking his every move. Then the road ahead of him vanished. The pavement crumbled into dirt and the trees seemed to shift, twisting unnaturally, blocking his path. His headlights flickered and the engine began to sputter. The forest itself was closing in on him, trapping him in its endless depths. Suddenly, his truck came to a screeching halt. Jake looked around in a panic. The road was gone, replaced by a thick blanket of fog. He couldn't see anything beyond a few feet ahead. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing in his mind. "You should have turned back." Jake felt something cold touch his shoulder. He jerked his head around, but no one was there. His breath quickened as the whispers grew deafening. The figures were closing in, their pale faces emerging from the fog surrounding his truck. With nowhere to go, Jake closed his eyes and gripped the wheel tightly, praying it was all a nightmare. The morning light broke through the trees. Search parties found Jake's truck abandoned deep in the forest a few days later. The vehicle was still in working condition, no signs of struggle, no signs of an accident, but Jake was gone. No trace of him was ever found. And now truckers warn each other about the lost highway deep within the forest, a road that appears on title, The Ghost of Whispering Pines. The story begins. It was a cold and moonless night when Roy Henderson found himself alone on a remote stretch of highway cutting through the Whispering Pines forest. The trees loomed tall and close on both sides of the road, their twisted branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. Roy had driven this route plenty of times before, but something about this night felt different, more oppressive. Maybe it was the fog that clung to the road, or maybe it was the eerie silence that surrounded him. No animals stirred, no wind rustled the leaves. Only the low hum of his truck's engine broke the stillness. Roy had been driving trucks for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from lumber to heavy machinery. He was used to the long hours and late nights, but tonight, the loneliness gnawed at him. It was the kind of night that made you wish you had a co-pilot, had someone to keep you company. But tonight, it was just him and the dark, winding road. As he drove deeper into the forest, his headlights caught something on the side of the road. At first, he thought it was a deer, its pale body standing motionless in the fog. But as he drew closer, Roy realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was a woman. She stood barefoot on the edge of the forest, her long white dress torn and dirty, her hair matted and hanging over her face. She looked lost, confused. Instinctively, Roy slowed his truck and rolled down the window. His heart raced as he called out, "Hey, you okay? You need some help?" The woman slowly turned her head to face him, her hair parting just enough for Roy to see her face. His breath caught in his throat. Her skin was ashen, her eyes dark and sunken. She looked like she hadn't slept or eaten in days, maybe weeks. She didn't say a word, just stared at him with those hollow, empty eyes. A chill ran down Roy's spine. Something wasn't right. Every instinct told him to drive away, to leave this strange woman behind. But something else, a sense of duty or maybe morbid curiosity, kept him rooted in place. "Do you need a ride?" Roy asked, his voice uneasy. "I can take you to the nearest town." The woman finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's too late. You shouldn't be here." Roy furrowed his brow. "What do you mean too late? Are you hurt? What's going on?" The woman slowly raised her hand, pointing deeper into the forest. "They're coming," she said, her voice trembling. "They always come for those who stay too long." Roy followed her gaze but saw nothing but the thick blanket of trees and fog. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the creeping dread building in his chest. "Listen, lady, just get in the truck. We'll get out of here, all right?" But when he turned back to her, the woman was gone. She had vanished, as if she had never been there at all. The haunting begins. Roy's heart pounded in his chest. He quickly scanned the area, but there was no trace of the woman. No footsteps, no movement in the trees, nothing. It was like she had disappeared into thin air. Unease settled in the pit of his stomach. He rolled up the window and shifted the truck back into gear, speeding up the road in hopes of leaving the unsettling encounter behind him. But as he continued driving, the forest seemed to grow darker, the fog thicker. His headlights barely cut through the gloom, and every shadow seemed to twist and shift at the edge of his vision. The road, once a familiar path, now felt foreign and strange, as though it was leading him somewhere he wasn't meant to go. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Roy saw her again, the same woman standing by the side of the road, her pale figure barely visible through the fog. His heart skipped a beat. He had passed her miles back, and yet here she was again, standing in the same white dress with the same hollow eyes. Roy slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a screeching halt. He stared at the woman through the windshield, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered under his breath. This time, the woman didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, her eyes fixed on Roy, her expression a mix of sorrow and fear. Roy's skin crawled and a cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. He couldn't explain it, but he knew, deep down, that this wasn't a living person. This was something else, something not of this world. Against his better judgment, Roy stepped out of the truck. The cold night air bit into his skin, and the silence was deafening. He slowly approached the woman, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" The woman's gaze shifted, and she pointed again, deeper into the forest. This time, Roy heard something, a faint whisper, like the sound of wind through the trees, but there was no wind. The whisper grew louder, and soon it wasn't just one voice, but many, a chorus of ghostly murmurs echoing all around him. "They're here," the woman whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "You need to leave before they take you too." Roy's blood ran cold. He turned to look into the forest, and that's when he saw them. Dark shapes moving between the trees, shadowy figures drifting through the fog. They were closing in, their whispers growing louder and more frantic. He could feel their eyes on him, feel their cold presence creeping closer. Panic surged through Roy's veins. He sprinted back to his truck, slamming the door behind him and locking it. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, finally jamming them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and Roy floored the gas pedal, speeding down the road as fast as the truck could take him. The final twist. Roy didn't stop until he reached the outskirts of town, the lights of civilization finally piercing through the darkness. He pulled into a gas station, his heart still racing, and sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, trying to catch his breath. He glanced into his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman's ghostly figure standing behind the truck, but the road was empty. For a moment, Roy thought he had escaped, that it was over. But then he noticed something chilling. Handprints, small and pale, on the outside of his window. They weren't there before, and they weren't his. Roy stared at the handprints in horror as a low whisper filled the air inside the cab of the truck. "You can't run forever," the voice said, soft but unmistakable. Roy turned on every light in the truck, desperately trying to shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, but deep down he knew the truth. The forest had marked him, and the ghosts of whispering pines would never let him go. The end. No maps where time stands still and where those who enter may never return.